Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to finish the second part of my little small coding advice to make your functions better and your code slightly more readable. And some of the things I have here are a little more controversial. You may or may not agree. And the first thing I have is the abuse of the reduce function in JavaScript. So if you're looking at my screen, I have two functions here. Create user index and create user index for. The names are not the best, but they will both create an index of users by ID, right? So they will create a map or a hash where you pass in the ID of the user and you'll get the user back. They both receive an array of users, and basically there are these two implementations, right? So this one is a one-liner. You take the users array, you reduce it, you have a total object, and you have the user here, and you return object in which you spread the previous value, and you use a dynamic key name, and you can get it done in one line. And the second function is the same thing, just using a for loop. You create an index object, you iterate over the users, and for each user, in that index, you assign the user ID to the user, and then you return the index. Now, these two functions are the same thing, right? So I have a lot of people that prefer the first approach, a lot of people I work with. Personally, though, I think that this is like way too complicated for one line. There are a lot of things going on. You're spreading, you're creating a new object. You have to use the parens here because you're returning an object. Otherwise, these keys here would be understood as the function body. And you are using an object. You're reducing to an object. I am of the opinion that the reduce function should be used when you're reducing a collection to a very simple value. Maybe you're reducing it to a number. Maybe you want to add up all the numbers. I'll do that in a little bit, but maybe you're just trying to reduce it to a specific value or calculate some sort of aggregate, but a primitive data type. Now, if you're reducing to another array, like an array to another array or an array to an object, I tend to lean towards using a for loop because you just can't, look at this. You can't beat how simple this is. You create an object, you iterate over the users with the for, and you just assign it. And I thought that this was a rather unpopular opinion. It turns out that there are a lot of experienced developers that also advocate for this. And I'll leave a link to, I think it was the Google developers or something like that, that made a video on this topic, to my surprise. But because the truth is that with functional programming, and we have map for each, reduce, all these things, filter, it's great, but I like to the point where people have stopped using for loops altogether. And there are still a lot of scenarios when just you can't beat the simplicity, the readability of a for loop. It's just very easy to read, very easy to reason about. The second thing is using the right array prototype function. So for instance, here I have this dummy function, build user report, that receives an array of user results. By the way, I haven't put any types here. I haven't done user result or I haven't done any of that. I hope you can excuse that. And we're doing a couple of things here. We are putting all these users into a index by their email, into a map, and we're creating a leaderboard. So if you look here, I'm iterating over the user results array with a map. Okay, so just to give it like a type, I'm gonna assume that this is a user result array, just so you see that this is I don't have this defined anywhere. So I'm iterating and I'm not returning anything here. And I am not assigning this to anything, results or something. I'm not doing either of these things. So I'm just using map to iterate over the array. That's just annoying, right? Map, that's not the purpose of map. If that's the only thing you want, you can just use for each, okay? And that will iterate over the array. And that's basically what you want. Maybe there's a better way to do these sort of things. Maybe a for loop here, since you're doing more than one thing, would be easier to read, or maybe this is good enough, all right? But don't use map and discard the results. The other thing I have for you is to try to avoid using a map function or iterating and doing multiple things at once with a single function. So let me give you an example. Let's say that the requirement for this function is to return an array. Let's say that this will return an array that, or an object that has the total score for the team and the names of the people in the team, right? So how would you go about doing that? Let's say that you say, well, this would be for instance, team total. It starts in 0. And then you want to have the names of the people. So you do names and you do team.map, and then you do a user.name, and then you just return an array with total, team total, and then names. Okay. This is wrong because you are not really adding up the total for the team. So let's say that you wanted to fix that and you say, okay, so I'm going to do team.reduce, and I'm going to have a total and the user here, or a team member, and then you're going to return, you're going to return total plus plus member dot score, and you're going to start in 0. All right, now you have the right total and you have the names of the team. Okay, so now let's say that you say, okay, this is fine, but I don't want to iterate over the team twice. One to calculate the team total and the other one to calculate the names, right? So you'll do something like come here and you say, well, this will be 0. Here I will be, instead of doing something like this, I will do team total equals or plus equals user dot score, and then you return the user dot name so that you have the name of the user in this array. Think about what you're doing here. This line is a side effect, right? You are mutating something outside this function. This map is doing more than one thing now. It's not just mapping a user to a name, or we can actually maybe call this a member. We're not just taking a member and returning the member name to have an array of names. We're also calculating the total because we don't want to iterate multiple times. But now imagine that, it's obvious here with the tiny function, but imagine you had a larger map function. And by the way, if your map or your filter function starts getting too large, maybe you want to refactor that. They shouldn't be that big, right? But if let's say you have multiple lines here, this can get lost here. It becomes harder to read. So this is the kind of scenario where I think if you are going to iterate over a collection and you're going to do multiple things, you're going to map, you're going to index, you're going to calculate totals, you plan on doing multiple things in a single iteration, then maybe you should just use a for loop. Maybe you just want to do a plain old for. That's one way to do it. The other thing I could say is, well, if it's just teams have 5 people, this is pretty readable. So here's where you're doing that balancing act. What do you pick? Do you pick readability, or do you pick performance? And here's the thing, performance is important, but it's not the most important thing, right? So maybe you are willing to sacrifice performance to gain usability or a fancy looking UI or something like that. So, obviously there are systems where performance is the core of the system, and if you don't have bad performance, it's just terrible. But prefer to look at performance as a form of currency, right? Performance is sort of like money. It's like the money that you can spend to buy something else, right? So you want your code to have good performance because that gives you some sort of currency on, say, well, because I have good performance, I can afford to maybe write this function like this, right? And iterate twice because I have good performance. So performance should be a very important goal that you have, but just because it will enable you to leverage something else. Obviously, I'm not talking about if you're doing a stock trading, well, maybe performance is the fundamental thing, or if you're writing software for missiles or some critical system, yeah, well, then maybe you shouldn't be using JavaScript. But yeah, that's the thing I want to say. The last thing that I'll say is that, let me actually show you. This is a service that I picked from a real project that we have, that we had in a previous client. And I changed it so much that it's, you can't recognize it. You can't recognize the code. It's just way too different. But sort of like the principal structure is similar. But it's just, I edited a lot because of non-disclosure. I can't show you actual code. So I had to throw a bunch of things, move a bunch of things around. But I wanted to preserve sort of like the structure, so to speak. So this is an example of a service that is more like a utility package rather than a service, right? First of all, every method is static. So you never instantiate this, which I don't really like. So let's begin by deleting all the static keywords. And then let's look at some of the functions. So you have standardized article list. My guess is that this will receive articles and the current article list, and it will sanitize, meaning maybe it will remove, unwanted text or dangerous, cross-site scripting or something. Then you have methods called, if you come down to line 34, compare articles and check if should override. This is a public thing. What does this even mean? Check if should, set article content data. Set article content data, and it somehow takes the serialized data and it will parse it and it will set it. Okay. Set name for article. So we're looking at the name here of the type, and depending on the type, we set the type attribute to like sports or crime, depending on this kind of article type field. And then we assign that. See, what would I expect in this sort of service to have? Instead of having methods like this that are, it seems like what I feel like the way that this service was written is, okay, I was writing code that needed to manage articles, and I needed to sanitize things, and I needed to compare things, and I needed to parse, string values and things like that. So I took all those things that I needed and I put it in this service. So this service is like a very organic service that just came from what I needed at the moment, right? And I put it just there. It's like it's a service, it's a class, but it's more like a utils package that has a random code to do specific things. Whereas maybe this kind of functionality that you see as public here should be like maybe a private method, and the API you want to expose is more like create article. See, what I think is happening here is, I'm not sure about this because I don't fully understand the code, but what I think is happening is you are retrieving a list of articles from the web, and you had your own local store of articles, and you have to reconcile them. Like you have to update the articles that you have with the latest version from the server, because we have, a local data store. And so that you have something like this: compare articles and check if should override. Like maybe you take the server version and you take your local version and you compare them, and you see if the new version should override the old version, like replace the older, like refresh, rehydrate your local data store. But see, you're exposing that. That behavior should be really internal to the service. You should not be exposing that to anybody. You should be saying, well, refresh article list or something. And internally, you'll take your list, for instance, get articles, and then you will take, fetch or articles from API, and then you probably new or remote articles, and then you do local articles, and then you say, well, reconcile local and remote articles, and then you do something here like, oh, well, this, I wouldn't pick this name, but maybe, the overarching point I'm trying to make is that think about your service, what you want your service to expose, and based on that, build your service. Don't do it like the other way around where I need this, go grab the service, add it in there. Like, you're creating a lot of coupling. There's no abstraction. The service that I picked from the code base it doesn't abstract anything. If I want to understand how this works, I have to go read the implementation. Remember this: one of your overarching goals as a developer is to write code, to write abstractions for which the readers or the consumers of your abstractions can just look at your interface and not have to care about what it's doing underneath. Oh, well, you created an article service. Oh, well, I want to fetch articles. Oh, I want to refresh or rehydrate or reload my local database of articles. Oh, you want to, I want to delete an article. Okay, don't expose. Try to think, how can I not expose internals through my interface? That is like the hardest thing to do, and when you do it well, it makes a huge difference, right? Because the service I was showing you, I can't consume it. I don't understand it. I have to go ask the developer, hey, what does this do? What do you mean here? When somebody has to consume something you made, and they have to go look at your code and read it in order to understand, that in a small way, that's kind of a failure on your part or my part. And okay, sometimes the domain is very complex. Sometimes you can't avoid it. I'm not talking about situations in which you have such complexity, your engine is very difficult to reason about, and inevitably someone will have to read your code. But if you're not dealing with a very complex piece of logic, and yet someone still has to go and read the body of your function because your name is not clear, your signature is not clear, or because you are not abstracting things, right? I'll give you one closing example because this video is becoming overwhelmingly long. Imagine that you have a document service, and you have a method that is called save document to disk, save document to disk. And it receives a document and it returns true or false, or it returns null or an error. That's very obvious, right? So I want to save the document to disk and I just pass it a document and that's fine. Now imagine that internally the save document to disk has to convert the document to bytes and then has to store the bytes to disk. Serialize the document and then store it. Very simple things. Now imagine that, I'm gonna just put that in here. So we have a class document service that, imagine that now instead of exposing save document to disk, you just expose something like this. Convert document to bytes. It receives a document. It returns, I don't know, byte array? I don't know, what is the type? Just imagine something like this. And then you have save bytes to disk. And it returns, it receives a byte array. And it returns an error. Oops, or no. Right? Imagine an interface like this, full of squiggly lines here, but this is a bad interface, because if I take this document service and I want to save something to, I want to save a document, where's the save document? There's no, oh, I have to convert it to bytes and then take that and pass it to save bytes. See, this is not abstracting the internal behavior. What you want is something like just, oops, let's make this private. And let's make this private. And what you want to expose publicly is save document to disk. Or even save document. Maybe you could be to the network, you know? And then, yeah, this will return error or null, right? So just create the interface, try to abstract complexity, and try to avoid these things. These are, I know that this advice sounds kind of obvious. I see it all the time. Maybe I'll make future videos in which I go more concretely into real code, open source projects I've worked on, or things I've done where you see this and mistakes I've made in the past and stuff like that. So I hope this was useful to you, and you have a good day, and yeah, subscribe if you want to see more videos.